for the original inhabitants of this great continent, for the colonists and all the immigrants who came here, for the countless slaves brought here by force. Freedom would always be the touchstone, the true American dream. The endless search and the endless struggle for freedom would shape the destiny of America. At the start of the 17th century, America looms large in the mind of Europe. It is both a wilderness and a new Eden. And it is home to millions whose lives and ways are utterly different and utterly mysterious. Hoping to create a new home on the wild shores of the Hudson River, a group of British settlers land their ship, the Mayflower, hundreds of miles off course, just as winter approaches. Among them is William Bradford, a pious, thoughtful man who believes in purifying society through his religion.
After long beating at sea, blessed ye God of heaven, who had brought them over ye vast and furious ocean, and delivered them from all ye perils and miseries thereof.
Bradford and 87 of the 101 people aboard are pilgrims, driven out of England for challenging the dictates of the king. They've come to this desolate shore looking for the freedom to worship as they please. The other passengers have more simple desires. They want land and the wealth that it brings. The year is 1620. Wrote Bradford,
"It is a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men."
Within the first 4 months, over half the colonists perish, and the pilgrims don't know if they can make it to spring. Late that winter, out of the wilderness, come some unlikely saviors.
There presented himself a savage, which caused an alarm. He saluted us in English.
The Indians, an Abenaki named Samoset and his friend Squanto of the Patuxet tribe, have encountered Englishmen before. Squanto had once been captured and taken to Europe as a slave. Squanto takes pity on the helpless settlers and saves their lives by teaching them to fish and plant corn. That autumn, grateful to be alive, the Plymouth colony celebrates its first Thanksgiving. The colonists invite a local chief and 90 of his men, who bring 5 deer and other gifts. Remarked one of the colonists, Edward Winslow,
"They are a people without any religion or knowledge of any god, yet very trusty, quick of apprehension, right-witted, and just.
Squanto would later help Bradford negotiate treaties with his Indian neighbors. Life at the fledgling colony was good, and people lived in peace. Here was a land where people could breathe free, where they could fulfill all their dreams and ambitions. The Pilgrims are not the first English settlers to gain a foothold in the New World. Over a decade earlier, 105 men stepped ashore in Virginia. They had come to make their fortune, drawn by promises of land and gold. At first, the colonists find the land delightful, but Eden soon turns ugly. The land is swampy, the water nearly undrinkable. Disease takes them one after another. Proud English gentlemen who refuse to work the earth, they find themselves near starvation, despite gifts of food from local Indian tribes. They are reduced to stealing corn from the same Indians, who retaliate. Holding the Jamestown colony together is a remarkable man, skilled in battle, who believes he can tame both what he calls the wild savages and his reluctant fellow adventurers. His name is John Smith, and according to legend, a young Indian called Pocahontas will risk her life to save his. According to Smith's fanciful memoirs, he faces execution at the hands of Pocahontas' father, Chief Powhatan.
Having feasted me in their best barbarous manner, they dragged me to 2 great stones, and thereon laid my head, and being ready to beat out my brains, Pocahontas, the king's dearest daughter, got my head in her hands and laid her own upon mine to save me from death.
Smith abandons both Pocahontas and Jamestown soon after. Several years later, hoping to secure peace in this troubled land, Chief Powhatan gives his daughter in marriage to one of the other English settlers, John Rolfe. Through the Indians, Rolfe and other struggling colonists learn the secrets of tobacco. The savory leaf is a huge success in London, and soon the colonists are growing it everywhere, including the streets. Some years define a people and a land. On the 30th of July, 1619, 22 Englishmen walk into a small church. It is a day that marks the beginning of political liberty in America. The men are sworn in as members of the House of Burgesses, the first elected government in the colonies. As in England, only men can vote, and only men of property. But the seed of freedom has been planted in the fertile soil of the New World, and eventually it will grow into a revolution. Jamestown is on the verge of turning into a real community, but one crucial ingredient is still missing.
The initial group of settlers to Jamestown was overwhelmingly male, and this did not change to a great degree during the first several decades of settlement. So in 1619, the Virginia Company sent a ship with 90 eligible women to the colony. They were deliberately recruited from among the most respectable ranks of English society. The company hoped to improve the reputation of the colony, which didn't appear to be a very nice place for anybody to go to, and never mind a woman of perhaps some modest fortune or some good prospects of marriage.
Late that August in 1619, a Dutch ship sails into port with a terrible cargo. 20 African slaves, the first ever in North America, destined to labor in the fields of Virginia. Alongside freedom, a poisonous tradition takes root. Plymouth and Jamestown not only survive, they flourish. This brings the Great Migration, a flood of eager British colonists into New England. "20,000 are Puritans, cousins to the Pilgrims, Christian dissidents fleeing from persecution." As the ancestors of Franklin, Emerson, and Hawthorne, the Puritans will eventually help create a new American culture of self-reliance, individuality, and freedom. But the first Puritans are more concerned with God and land. Occupying that land are local Indian tribes like the Pequot and the Narragansett.
When the Europeans arrived along the Atlantic coast, they brought displacement because they took the land away. They brought disease, a whole host of diseases that Indians hadn't been exposed to, and of course they brought death. But the Indians weren't stupid. They learned how to trade. They learned how to carry on warfare with the whites, both as allies and as enemies. In fact, Indians and whites together formed an entirely new world for both of them.
In this new world, different dreams, different cultures, different visions of freedom all collide at once. The colonists ache for what they call the unused land around them. They believe they have the God-given freedom to take it. Their hunger would bring war. Chief Powhatan, Pocahontas' father, had once pleaded with the colonists for peace.
Why will you take by force what you may have quietly by love? Why will you destroy us who supply you with food? What can you get by war? Take away your guns and swords, the cause of all our jealousy, or you may all die in the same manner.
While some tribes, like the Iroquois, hold their own, others are utterly destroyed in local wars, like Powhatan's tribe in Virginia and the Pequot in New England. It is the shape of things to come. Pilgrim William Bradford had been saved by Squanto and the generosity of the Indians. But when it comes to land, Bradford is more than willing to send his Indian neighbors to their maker.
It was a fearful sight to see, the Pequot villagers thus frying in the fire, and the screams of blood quenching the same, and horrible was the stink and scent thereof. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave praise thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them.
If the Puritans had bloody dealings with the Indians, they also refused to tolerate any dissent from their own people.
They, of course, came to America with freedom on their minds, religious freedom. But once they achieved that objective in coming to America and setting up their own independent settlements, we immediately face all sort of paradoxes. That is, beginning with the fact that they began to persecute people who did not believe the way they did. In other words, you're free to worship as long as you worship the way they worship and believe the way they did. And one wonders, what kind of notion of freedom is that?
For insisting on the separation between church and state and preaching tolerance, Minister Roger Williams is driven into the wilderness in the dead of winter. Yet, in the New World, dissent isn't so easily crushed. Unbowed, Williams founds a new community devoted to liberty. In time, it would become Rhode Island. It is one of the freest places in the entire world. Puritan tyranny will lead to terror in the village of Salem, Massachusetts. The year is 1692. The young daughter of the local minister unexpectedly falls into long, deep trances. The girl blames Tituba, the family's West Indian slave. After a severe beating, Tituba confesses her guilt. A court is convened where she names her accomplices.
I've never hurt the children. I didn't mean to hurt the children.
The troubles have started. When they bring in the first of the accused witches, Goody Osborne, she is confronted by a group of teenage girls. Overcome, one girl accuses her of pinching and biting, of tormenting them in supernatural form.
Innocent. God.
The court condemns Goody Osborne, and 10 days later, she dies in prison due to ill treatment. It is just the beginning. Soon, ordinary people throughout the colony are accused of witchery. People who confess are not executed. Only those who declare their innocence are killed. The trials finally come to a halt on April 30th, 1693, the day the governor of Massachusetts finds his wife under suspicion of witchcraft. Over 150 people have been arrested and 19 people executed. No one knows exactly why the witch madness took hold the way it did, yet the trials would forever remind us that even in America, life and freedom can easily be destroyed. Even madness like Salem couldn't stop the astonishing growth of the colonies. People of every sort keep coming to America's shores, from England, Holland, France, hoping to create a better and freer life. America is already a land of immigrants, small farmers, mechanics, and clerks. Well over half the Europeans come as servants, indentured servants. After laboring for several long, hard years, they will be set free with a chance to make their way in a new world. For these Europeans, America promises one thing above all: land. The colonies are a place where an ordinary man, by pluck or guile or both, can own his own piece of land, as he never could in the crowded villages and towns of the Old World. But for other new arrivals, neither land nor freedom is within reach.
By 1700, if you were black in Virginia, you were definitely a slave. There are a lot of reasons for this. One reason was that in the nostrils of the English, Virginia began to smell very bad because white servants would go out there, would expect to work their way to freedom, but in fact would be worked to death.
To replace white servants, the planters purchase African slaves to do the back-breaking work. Considered an inferior people, they will be forced to live in permanent slavery, as will their children and their children's children. British or French, servant or aristocrat, everyone wants a piece of the bounteous American continent. Some colonists head for the frontier, the vast land just beyond the edge of Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston. In the clear, open air of America, they seek the chance to invent whole new lives. These same frontier lands also mean freedom to Indians and the continued survival of their ancient communities. To keep colonists at bay, some tribes sign alliances with the French government, others with the British. The chief of the Abenaki,
"We tell you, brother, that we like nothing better than to be at peace. And it needs only that our English brothers keep peace with us. We will not give up an inch of that land which we inhabit."
In the mid-1750s, Indians and colonists alike will be drawn into a huge conflict between Britain and France, called the 7 Years' War. It will leave the New World exhausted and bleeding. An ambitious and somewhat aloof young surveyor from Virginia helps ignite the conflict in 1754. His name, George Washington. In battle, he will discover his gift for war and for leadership. The French hold a vast territory from Canada to Louisiana and control it with heavily armed forts. Serving in the Virginia militia, the 21-year-old Washington delivers a letter to the French at Fort Le Boeuf, which guards the Ohio Valley. The message demands that the French withdraw from their own territory. The French commander refuses, violently. Commented George Washington,
"I have heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound."
Promoted to colonel, Washington volunteers as a guide to British General Braddock. Braddock arrogantly rejects the young Virginian's advice on how to properly fight a backwoods war, then pays the price. Braddock and 400 men die, and Washington has 2 horses shot out from under him. Washington learns an unexpected lesson. The British Army is far from invincible. Despite Braddock's death and other losses, England eventually wins the war and drives France out of America. Young Washington begins the war hoping for British recognition, but by the end, he feels more like a Virginian than an Englishman. The war between England and France will forever change America. At war's end, England is nearly bankrupt. Insisting that the colonies pay a share of their own upkeep and defense, England passes the Stamp Act of 1765 in the middle of a colonial depression, affecting Bibles, almanacs, legal documents, and playing cards, anything printed. It is the first direct tax ever levied on Americans, and it leads to riots across the colonies. Outrage runs like fever through the land and alienates the colonists from their very identity as British subjects. In the Virginia House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry, the son of a frontier farmer, bitterly denounces the tax.
"If this be treason, make the most of it."
His wealthy fellow Virginian George Washington likes it no better.
Parliament hath no more right to put their hands into my pockets without my consent than I have to put my hand into yours for money.
The Stamp Act is repealed the next year, but England continues to insist that it rules the colonies. And no matter how much they might rebel, the Americans do not, in fact, rule themselves. The British presence in the colonies grows more disturbing and more inflammatory with each passing year. New taxes, new riots, and even more violence. In 1770, it is neither taxation nor representation, but ice that leads to tragedy. An angry colonist throws a chunk of ice at a British soldier guarding Boston's customs house, knocking him down. British reinforcements soon appear to control the crowd. In a moment of terrible confusion, several of the soldiers mistake a shout for an order to fire. 5 people die, including a sailor named Crispus Attucks. Of African American and Indian ancestry, he is the first of many people of color who will die for American liberty. The incident, known as the Boston Massacre, fuels the growing fury. Frustrations erupt again on December 16, 1773, again in Boston, over tea. Protesting restrictions on the tea trade, a group of local mechanics, artisans, and merchants head down to the harbor dressed as Mohawk Indians. Led by Sam Adams, a former beer maker better at brewing trouble, they call themselves the Sons of Liberty. As one bystander put it,
the Sons of Liberty boarded the ships, and without much deliberation, knocked open the chests and emptied several thousand weight of the finest tea into the ocean.
For Sam Adams and others, it is a chance to keep up American anger toward the mother country. Adams' intentions are clear. He wants to be free of England, and that means revolution. To demand their rights as free-born Americans, 55 of the wealthiest and most influential men in the colonies, including Sam Adams, John Adams, Patrick Henry, John Hancock, meet together on September 1774 in Philadelphia. At the First Continental Congress, they take the first step toward inventing a new nation. Violence is in the air, and the Continental Congress resolves that if the British use force against the people of Massachusetts, all Americans ought to support them in resistance. On March 23, 1775, firebrand Patrick Henry utters the words that still ring in our ears today.
Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, God Almighty. I know not what course others may take, but for me, give me liberty or give me death.
On the eve of open warfare, few colonists consider revolution. Most Americans have no desire for independence from England. They want fair treatment. It will be the king and his army of occupation in Massachusetts that will push them to the edge. On the 18th of April, 1775, General Thomas Gage, commander of all the British troops in North America, readies a column of 800 men. His orders: put down the rebellious local militia known as the Minutemen. Night does little to mask the British movements. Boston is full of Patriot spies. Silversmith Paul Revere races ahead to warn of the coming raid. It is to be the most famous horse ride in American history.
I set off upon a very good horse. After I passed Charlestown Neck, I saw two men on horseback. When I got near them, I discovered they were British officers. One tried to get ahead of me, and the other tried to take me. I got clear. And after that, I awakened almost every house till I got to Lexington.
Daybreak. 841 British troops, the Redcoats, arrive on Lexington Green to face a ragtag group of 70 Minutemen. No one knows who fires first, but within minutes, 8 Americans are dead and 10 wounded. The British march on unimpeded. At North Bridge in Concord, a larger force of Americans awaits them. Now both sides suffer casualties. 2 Concord men die, 3 Redcoats fall, and the whole thing is over in 3 minutes. This is the shot heard round the world. Hearing the actual musket fire, Revolutionary leader Sam Adams exclaims, "What a glorious morning this is." As the British fall back to Boston, they are besieged on all sides by patriots. "273 English soldiers are killed or wounded." Within 24 hours, the city of Boston, occupied by British troops, is under attack by Patriot militiamen. Proclaims the Continental Congress,
"Our cause is just, our union is perfect, and being with one mind resolved to die as free men rather than live as slaves."
Now openly rebellious, the Continental Congress establishes an army to fight for the rights of all Americans. But who is to lead it? One Virginia delegate arrives at the hall in uniform and volunteers to serve as commander-in-chief for no pay. Although he is untested as a general, Congress unanimously accepts his offer. This is the moment George Washington has strived for. He is utterly confident he is the right man. Just as ordinary people had refused the tyrannies of the king, it is ordinary people, farmers and laborers, who will fight and die for liberty. At Boston's Bunker Hill, 1,000 British soldiers die, while the colonials lose less than 500. Here is proof that the untrained ragtag patriots can stand up to the best of England. But the war is just beginning, and the American militia is soon driven from Boston. It will take more than bullets to defeat the British and create a new America. The powerful words of one man, Thomas Paine, will help transform a war into a revolution.
Tom Paine was one of the more unusual men who made the American Revolution. He came from the lower classes of England, unlike most of the leaders of the Revolution who were fairly prominent merchants or planters or lawyers in the American colonies. He only arrived in America in 1774, just really on the eve of independence. He came with sentiments about the poor in England and how they were mistreated, dislike of hereditary rule and monarchy. Early in 1776, he wrote the famous pamphlet Common Sense, which was the first public call for American independence.
120,000 copies sell in just 3 months to farmers, tradesmen, seamen, and laborers.
O ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only the tyranny, but the tyrant, stand forth. Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom has been hunted around the globe.
He called for a new democratic kind of government in what would become the United States, and the mission of the American Revolution was to create what he said, an asylum for liberty. In other words, this was not just the movement of a couple of million people on one side of the Atlantic battling the mother country. Why should someone in France or Germany or some other country care about that? But the reason was this was part of the worldwide expansion of freedom, and America would be this asylum of liberty.
The idea of liberty for all is not lost on colonial women, especially Abigail Adams. She makes a pointed suggestion to her husband John, a delegate to the Continental Congress, concerning the rights of women.
Remember the ladies. Remember all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation.
Women are not about to stand by and let men fight the revolution without them. Many, like Sarah Osborne, follow her blacksmith husband to war.
Washing, mending, and cooking for the soldiers, in which I was assisted by the other females.
These women were oftentimes cooking meals. They were doing the laundry as frequently as laundry actually got done for these Continental Army soldiers. And they were also doing small things like darning socks and mending, which actually was quite important because the supplies to the Continental Army were never as plentiful as they should have been.
A private's wife, nicknamed Molly Pitcher, goes from carrying water for her husband's gun crew to manning his post when he is wounded. And Deborah Sampson, a former indentured servant, takes a more unusual route, enlisting in the 4th Massachusetts as Robert Shurtleff. She serves with distinction, discovered only when she becomes ill with fever at the end of the war.
Before the Revolution, when people talked about being a woman, it was usually a matter of a judge or a minister telling women how they ought to behave, what they ought to do. But almost at the moment of independence, women's voices begin to be heard. "Remember the ladies," says Abigail Adams to her husband, John. "Why should I not have liberty whilst you strive for liberty?" asks Mary Hayburn of New Jersey to her soldier husband, also John. "Women run farms while men are away fighting. Women run businesses while men are away legislating or raising money to support the war effort. Women learn to do all sorts of things that they previously hadn't thought they were capable of doing, and once you learn something like that, you can't unlearn it."
In early summer of 1776, the Continental Congress is ready to proclaim its independence from England. To compose a formal declaration, they choose a gifted writer, Virginian Thomas Jefferson, at 32, the youngest delegate. A shy, even withdrawn young man, he would have preferred to stay on his plantation due to his wife's poor health and his mother's death in the spring. But his talents are needed and his duty clear. Jefferson intends the document to be an expression of the American mind, but it is far more than that.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to abolish it and institute a new government.
On July 4th, delegates vote to pass the unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America. Bonfires are lit in celebration all across Philadelphia. In New York City, a statue of the king is toppled and ultimately melted down, providing some 42,000 bullets for the revolution.
The Declaration both established the principles of revolution and made it possible in the future for other Americans to claim the right to oppose the government if they felt that their own natural rights were being violated.
What you find in the Declaration instead is the beginnings of a new agenda, what I like to call an American agenda, centered around Jefferson's own words, all men are created equal. That raised very big problems for American society because the reality was that people weren't equal at all. Still, it gave people a goal to aim for, and we've been aiming for it ever since.
Independence is one thing, winning the war is another. The next months are desperate ones for the Continental Army. The British force the rebels to retreat at virtually every encounter. Just when things look bleakest, Washington crosses the Delaware on Christmas Day, 1776, launching a surprise attack against Hessian mercenaries occupying Trenton, New Jersey. It's a stunning move that proves the homegrown army and its commander will not accept defeat. As one observer declares, the maneuver revived the depressed spirits of the colonists and produced an immediate and happy effect in recruiting. The British are doing some recruiting of their own. The king offers freedom to all able-bodied slaves who will fight against the colonists. Many slaves seize their chance and join the English. A famous slave owner, George Washington, moves to counter the inflammatory British proposal.
This stimulated George Washington, the commander of the Continental Forces, to change his initial policy, which had been to exclude blacks from the army and to allow them to enroll, mostly free Negroes. But eventually slaves could also go into the Revolutionary Army. Maybe about 5,000 fought under Washington's army during the Revolution, mostly from the northern colonies and states.
During the war, Vermont becomes the first place in the Western world to abolish slavery. Massachusetts and New Hampshire soon follow. October 1777. At Saratoga, New York, the unexpected happens. A colonial army overpowers 7,000 British troops, cutting them to pieces. 1/4 of the English army in North America is forced to surrender. Suffering in the defeat are Indians who fight alongside the British to protect their own lands and their freedom. Hearing of the huge American victory, the King of France, Louis XVI, commits his fleet and 6,000 French soldiers, crucial support for the fledgling United States. Despite the success at Saratoga, Washington is still in serious trouble. Losing Philadelphia to the enemy, he withdraws his army to Valley Forge in the heart of winter. Over 2,000 of his 12,000 men will die during the icy season. But their spirit and their willingness to suffer the worst does not waver. Wrote Private Joseph Plum Martin,
"The army was now not only starved but naked, destitute of all other clothing, especially blankets. But we were engaged in the defense of our injured country and were willing, nay, determined to persevere."
From an admiring George Washington,
"To see men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lie upon, and submitting without a murmur, is a proof of patience and obedience which, in my opinion, can scarcely be paralleled."
October 19th, 1781, the 7th year of the war. Under siege by the Americans, cut off by the French Navy, his men sick with disease, British General Cornwallis surrenders his army at Yorktown, Virginia, virtually ending the war. The British military band plays "The World Turned Upside Down."
Nobody expected when the war began that it was going to take 7 years. Nobody expected that there would be thousands and thousands of deaths. Colonials, on the point of becoming Americans, thought that their own virtue would quickly defeat the British. Look what happened at Lexington and Concord. Look what happened at Bunker Hill. They found, however, that they were up against professionals who fought long and hard and honorably. In the midst of all the suffering that it took to defeat those professionals, I guess the only answer as to why they did do it is something like this. People sometimes start out on what they think is going to be a short road, and it turns out to be a very long road indeed. And they find within themselves what it takes to walk every step of the way.
It has taken 7 terrible years. Yet even after suffering a long string of military disasters, desertions, and mutinies, Washington and his homegrown army have persevered. Independence is won, American freedom assured. The revolution is not a triumph for everyone. The great losers are the Indians. Most tribes fought on the side of the British. Once the war is over, they have no place to go. And now they have a new nation, the American nation, to contend with.
One way or another, the war and the revolution changed how everybody lived between the Atlantic seaboard and the Mississippi River. For slaves, the revolution and the war were paradoxical. We might say that a window was half opened, and that some people climbed through that towards freedom. Some did it by going to the British, who welcomed the slaves of rebels as weakening the American side. And when it was all over and the British departed, a large number of black people departed with them, heading for Newfoundland, heading for England, heading even for Sierra Leone. Others challenged white America to live up to its own words, and in this sense, the revolution marks the beginnings of slavery's destruction.
In the aftermath of the Revolution, white women do not appear to have made radical claims to have equal political rights with men. They did not envision themselves as citizens like their husbands and fathers and brothers, but rather carved out a different role for themselves as the educated mothers and wives of male citizens. And in this way, they saw themselves as having an indirect role to play in politics.
The new United States, with its explosive ideas of liberty and equality, will inspire democratic change around the world. (1783), a peace treaty signed, Washington puts down his sword and returns to Mount Vernon to resume the role of wealthy gentleman planter.
He's remarkable not because he was a military genius, he wasn't really, And he wasn't a great writer, and he wasn't a deep thinker, but he understood power. He understood how to get it. He understood how to use it. He understood how to fend off people who wanted to challenge his power. Most of all, he knew how to give power up. Most people in his time could not imagine giving up power. Once you had it, you wanted more. He could have been an American Cromwell. He could have been an American Caesar. And yet he chose not to do this. He was far too committed to the idea that people could rule themselves rather than be ruled. And so he gave up his sword and gave up his commission when the war ended.
But Washington is worried for the new nation. War has left ordinary people, including many unpaid veterans of Washington's army, exhausted, nearly destitute, and deeply in debt. For them, America is not living up to its promises. Angry citizens like Massachusetts farmer and veteran Daniel Shays even lead short-lived revolts against the government. The rebellions greatly alarm the powers that be. Yet Thomas Jefferson, writing from Paris, sees such uprisings as virtuous and even necessary.
I hold that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants.
To create a stronger, more central government for the distressed nation, an urgent call goes out from prominent, wealthy men like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton for a constitutional convention. 55 delegates, including George Washington, spend 3 months arguing in secret over power and the shape of the government to come. It is finally ready in September 1787, a constitution for the United States of America, promising order and stability. But not everyone is happy with the government this document proposes. Would it create a new tyranny of wealth and property in place of the king? Or would it create a strong, stable nation with freedom for all? Americans are deeply divided. To save the Constitution, a compromise is needed. It is to be a guarantee of people's rights, a Bill of Rights to protect the citizens from their new, more powerful government. This Bill of Rights would provide written guarantees for freedom of religion, speech, the press, and assembly, all protections against the tyranny of power.
I think it's important to emphasize that freedom is not something that emerges initially full-blown from the heads of great men, but it's something which emerges from the struggles between different groups of individuals, the struggle between indentured white servants and their masters, between slaves and slaveholders, between colonists and the British colonizers. In all these struggles, different dimensions of the call to freedom emerges, and is given meaning and is redefined. And that process continues today.
To assure a bright future for the new republic, the Constitutional Congress moves to select the nation's first president. They turn to the man who has led the country through the crucible of war and guided it through a troubled peace. On New York's Wall Street on April 30th, 1789, George Washington is sworn in. To the 57-year-old Washington, it is a day of uncertainty.
I am entering upon an unexplored field, enveloped on every side with clouds and darkness.
Yet, admired throughout the nation, Washington will help the new country find its way. Soon after his inauguration, Washington addresses a letter to the Hebrew congregation of Rhode Island.
If we have the wisdom to make the best use of the advantages with which we are now favored, we cannot fail to become a great and happy people.
A new century awaits the young nation. It will be a time of growth, of struggle, of freedom.